the book of Acts begins where the Gospels end, and that is with the resurrection appearance of Jesus and commanding them to stay in Jerusalem until the Spirit comes upon them. And then Jesus says in 1:8, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. And that just happens to be the thematic outline of the book of Acts, because it starts with the disciples bearing witness to the resurrected Christ in Jerusalem. Then it spreads out a little bit beyond Jerusalem. Then it ends up in Samaria, of all places. And then it goes from Samaria to the uttermost parts of the world, which in this case ends up in Acts 28 in Rome, because all roads lead to Rome, and it is the uttermost end of the earth, so to speak. Okay, so Acts begins with a resurrection appearance, as the Gospels, or at least 3 out of 4 of them, end with resurrection appearances. Now, one quick thing that I might mention to you is that Luke, who wrote both the Gospel and the Acts, is not quite sure about when this ascension thing happened. As I mentioned before, in Luke 24, it appears on Easter night. In Acts 1, it seems to have happened 40 days later on Ascension Thursday. And so Luke himself doesn't seem to be too uptight about chronology. And I've often said to my students, and we shouldn't be either. So here it is. He ascends, and then he makes sure that they're prepared for what's going to happen to them at Pentecost. And then, of course, the Spirit comes, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, one of the things that I want us to focus on are these eyewitnesses, these people who saw Christ. They are transformed into these bold and charismatic witnesses. And in fact, they endure all kinds of hardship and difficulty. And that's focused primarily in some of these witnesses, including Peter and Paul. Now, so the first 12 chapters of Acts is really focused on Peter. And then in chapter 13, it shifts to Paul. So it's a kind of, instead of saying it's the Acts of all the apostles, it's really kind of like Acts of Peter and Paul and a couple of other guys. So that's the way you should see Acts. And the way Luke sets up Acts, anything Peter can do, Paul can do too. So they're seen as a tandem that are not necessarily competing with each other, but they're directed toward different audiences. Peter primarily to a more Jewish audience, and Paul a more Gentile audience. So that's the big picture in Acts. Now, when Paul comes on the scene in chapter 9, and he has a resurrection experience on the road to Damascus, then you start seeing how important these resurrection appearances are, because Peter's had a resurrection experience, right, in Acts 1. Well, Paul is going to have his in chapter 9. And that's what leads both of them to becoming witnesses to the ends of the earth. Now, if you're interested in this sort of thing, Acts relates Paul's Damascus Road resurrection appearance of Jesus 3 times. In chapter 9, it's a narrative, and it's in the third person. Then in chapter 22, it's a first person retelling. Paul's telling his story. And then again in chapter 26, Paul retells his story. Now, think about that. 28 chapters, the same story is related 3 times. What's going on there? I think what's going on there is this. Before Paul, all of the resurrection appearances were more or less to Jesus' friends and supporters, or those at least who were part of the Jesus company. But when you get to Paul, you're dealing with an opponent. And as far as we know, Paul is the only opponent of Jesus that has a resurrection experience. And that transforms him from a fire-breathing Pharisee to a Christian apostle. And it changes his life, and it changes the world. Now, One of the most important passages, at least to me, in the book of Acts is chapter 23 in verse 6, where, and if you happen to have your Bible and you want to turn over to that, Acts 23:6 is, for me, the favorite verse in all of Acts regarding the resurrection. Why? Because Paul has been drugged before the council in Jerusalem, the same people that had condemned Jesus to death. And he's defending himself. And he looks out into this council or the Sanhedrin, and he recognizes that it's a mixed audience. Now, remember what Aristotle said about rhetoric, about public speaking. The most important thing is what? Know your audience. So Paul knows his audience, and this is what he says in 23:6. When Paul saw that some of the group were Sadducees and the others were Pharisees, he called out in the council, "Fellow Israelites, I am a Pharisee, the son of Pharisees. I am on trial because of the hope I have that the dead will rise to life." I'm a Pharisee. As soon as he said this, the Pharisees and Sadducees started to quarrel, and the group was divided. For the Sadducees say that people will not rise from the dead, that there are no angels or spirits, but the Pharisees believe in all three. So the shouting became louder. So what happens here in the jury room, there's a fist fight, so to speak, between Sadducees and Pharisees. And so, as they say in law, Stephen, it's a hung jury, right? They can't come to a conclusion about what to do with Paul. And this is a wonderful moment. And I think it's one of Luke's most clever narratives in the entire book, because he sets Paul up into the most important judicial place of Judaism, and he interjects into that scene his Pharisaic belief that the dead will rise. And he doesn't even have to say that Christ is risen. He just has to say the dead will rise. And boom, the jury goes nuts, right? It's a great moment. It's actually my favorite scene. And well, except for the time when Paul preaches all night and Eutychus falls asleep and falls dead. But that's another story. Okay. So at this point, I would
You've
say
never had that happen, have you, Frank?
and no one's told me that, but Matthew, have you ever been charged with that? Anyway.
Nobody's ever died on my watch, but I've seen a few heads nod.
Yeah. I'm sure I've killed a couple of spirits or two. Anyway, okay. So the book of Acts is set up like this. These followers of Jesus, ragtag bunch, experience resurrection appearances. They then experience the Spirit of Christ within them. And they end up going throughout the whole world to tell the story. Now, let me emphasize once again a narrative point. These disciples would not have turned into apostles meaning those who were sent, unless they had experienced both a resurrection narrative experience and the Spirit of Christ within them. It's a powerful transformation of these people. And I think that's the greatest part about Acts. Now, I've listed for you all the places in Acts where resurrection narrative or preaching is involved. But you'll notice too that there are two resuscitation scenes in Acts. There's one by Peter in chapter 9, and there's Paul in chapter 20. So remember those resuscitation scenes we looked at in the Gospels, about 4 or 5 of them, you know? Well, Peter and Paul have those, because whatever Peter can do, Paul can do. And so they both have that experience. Let me just stop and see if you have any comments about the resurrection theology in the book of Acts. It's absolutely essential to the preaching. In other words, how can you have preaching about someone who's dead? That's just a tragedy and a miscarriage of justice. But when the one who is dead is risen, to reign with God and to give the Spirit, then that's a different story, isn't it? A radically different story. Your comments or thoughts about Acts before we go on to some of Paul's letters? Yeah, Lane. Unmute.
I would just like to state for the record that I believe.
Okay, I don't think I quite caught that, Lane.
I said I would just like to state for the record that I feel like I can be a Christian and not believe in an actual resurrection from the
Yep. And as you and I have talked,
dead, of Jesus or anybody else.
Right. Bultmann's position is that these resurrection appearances are actually internal experiences that people, that Christ, as it were, rose within them, in a conscious, internal way. We'll get to that more when we talk about objections to the resurrection in a week or so. Okay. Now, yeah, go ahead, Diane.
Don't you think that having this open-ended, it could be either way, is actually a way to draw more people to Christianity that might have different needs? And for many people, death is such a fearsome event that the thought of life everlasting is really like the hook that pulls you into Christianity.
Well, Diana, I would say if you study the history of Christian thought, there's a wide range of views about the nature of Jesus' resurrection, as we know. And so lots of people have been drawn into this story with lots of different interpretations of what happened.
Well, I just think that the wider your viewpoint is, the more people can fit into Christianity, and that not making it just one thing allows more people to feel like they could be a part of it.
Right. And I'm sure that's true. People are drawn to Christianity for lots of different reasons, right? So let's keep it an open-ended invitation instead of thus you must do step 1, 2, 3, 4. People come to the Christian faith oftentimes through the back door. So let's leave that open too.
The coffee on Sunday morning.
Yeah, especially. Yeah. Okay, so with your permission, let's go to Paul. And before we get to the thing I sent you about the meaning of Jesus' resurrection in Paul, what I want us to do is look at 3 different texts that are absolutely essential to understanding Paul's view of resurrection. And the most important one, of course, is 1 Corinthians 15. So if you have a Bible and you want to turn over there, and I want to start by saying that Paul has 2 big questions that he has to address in 1 Corinthians 15. And the first question is, quite simply, what do you mean that we are raised? There's a bodily resurrection. A lot of people say, look, that's simply impossible. That's not even within the realm of possible. And by the way, who are those folks? Those are the descendants of the Sadducees, right? And et cetera, who said this just can't be possible. And the other big question is this: what kind of resurrection body are we talking about? If that's true, what's it supposed to look like, right? So he has 2 questions. Is it possible? And if it is possible, what are people going to look like, in this resurrected body? But I want to start with what, in my opinion, is the way to look at 1 Corinthians 15. And here's the way you look at it. You look at it first from the point of view of the first 11 verses, and then you skip to 29 through 34, and then you go to verse 58. Now, what am I talking about? The whole point of Paul's theology of resurrection is this, and Lane, you'll really like this, is the fact that people's lives have been transformed. And he starts with witnesses to the resurrection, a whole group of them, and how they were transformed because of it. And he alludes to himself as the last in that long line of witnesses. And his life was transformed. Okay. Then if you go to verses 29 through 34, he does a kind of a what if there is no resurrection? And his answer in the what if there is no resurrection is that it has a profound negative impact in his mind on one's ethical life. And he will quote from Ecclesiastes, thus eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. We'll come to that in a moment. And then at the very end of 1 Corinthians 15, he says, and the upshot of this resurrection theology is be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. In other words, because your labor is not in vain. So again, let me restate that. He starts off with people whose lives were transformed, including himself. Then he, in the middle of this chapter, he says, well, what if all this is untrue? Then eat, drink, and be merry, you know. And then he, at the very end, he reiterates that the resurrection theology has real existential consequences of producing a fruitful, active, hopeful, giving life. So if I could just say that twice and help you see that this is not so much theory as it is this impacts your life and how you live it. That makes sense? So think of this not so much as resurrection theory as resurrection practice, that these become resurrection people in their lives and in their witness and in their work in the name of the Lord. Okay. So far, so good? All right. If you look at, go ahead.
Can I ask
Go
a
ahead,
question on that? So, I mean, yeah, it makes perfect sense. And then I think of the early Christians in you know, what later became the United States, and the complete opposite of how they lived their lives. That it was, instead of being fruitful and you know, seeking joy in it, it was so fear based, right? So resurrection can also lead. My question is, can resurrection theology also lead to a complete fear-based life that instead turns punitive?
Oh, it can lead to all kinds of crap, you know. I mean, look, one of the worst aspects of resurrection theology, in my opinion, Judy, is that it leads to what? Beam me up theology. You know, let's get the heck out of Dodge. This world is falling apart. I want nothing to do with it. Beam me up, Scotty, you know. And so it becomes an escapism thing. I just want to be with the Lord, you know. I just want to go away, fly away. And that's one consequence of resurrection theology too. Another one is, look, I'm resurrected and I am better than thou, you know. So it can become judgmental. Resurrection, by the way, was a controversial subject in the first century church, and it was misconstrued all over the place. And that's why Paul has to address it again and again and again, right? It's not a simple issue. By the way, before we go on another point, basically in the first century Mediterranean world, there were three options regarding death. The most widespread view in the Mediterranean world, the first century, was when you die, it's done. That's the end of the story, period. That was the consistent belief among most people in the Mediterranean. There's a, you know, in some of our gravestones, you'll see RIP, rest in peace. You know, one of the most consistent gravestones in the first century was, I was, I am not, I don't care. You know, meaning I'm done. The show's over. End of story. All right. So that was the most consistent one. And secondly, there was the Platonic notion of the immortality of the soul, which we'll get to in a moment, which was, by the way, a brand new idea introduced into the Mediterranean world, probably brought over from versions of Hinduism that came across Turkey and that Plato eventually adopted in Greece, but we'll get to that in a moment. And then there's this third idea, this really minority view, actually, in Judaism called the resurrection of the body. So Paul is swimming against a current that says, look, either we're all just dead and done, and that's the end of the story, or this immortal soul, which we'll get to in a moment, or this resurrection. Paul's in a minority position in the Mediterranean world. And therefore, you can see why so many people keep asking him questions. What is this you're talking about, Paul? Right? Okay. All right. So go back to 1 Corinthians 15. And what he ends up doing here at the beginning of this long chapter, it's one of his longest chapters in all the book, he will go on and say, look, the only way I can really argue for the resurrection is that some of us had this experience. And so it raises the interesting question of the value and importance of religious experience, right? And he says, these folks, including myself, we experience something. It's hard to explain. Later, by the way, Paul will say he had a kind of an ecstatic experience that he can't even talk about. But he can talk about this. But here's what he says at the end of 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 11. He says this, verse 10, but by God's grace, I am what I am. And that grace that he gave me was not without effect. On the contrary, I worked harder than any other of the apostles, although it was really not my own doing, but God's grace working within me. So 1 Corinthians 1 through 11, it's about religious experience that does what? Leads to a transformed life. Remember that. The point of resurrection is transformed lives whose witness bears witness to the resurrection. Okay, that's the first point. By the way, that section about 500, and some of whom are still alive, that might have been the Matthew 28 on the mountaintop, but we're not really sure. So that's how it starts. So he doesn't actually make what you would call a philosophical argument about the reality of the resurrection. He basically says, I saw him. You know, that's it. Or in our culture, we'd probably rephrase it like this. Well, you had to be there. You had to be there. Okay. Now, the next part, 20 through 28, here he tries to deal with folks who say, this is just not possible. This bodily resurrection thing you're proposing is just simply theologically, physiologically impossible. And so what does he do? He argues on the basis that because Jesus was raised from the dead, and we saw him, that he is kind of the first fruits of what will eventually happen for all people. But he argues both ways. He says, look, if the resurrection of the body in theory is not possible, then Jesus' resurrection is not possible. Then he flips it. If Jesus' resurrection is not possible, then the future resurrection of all people is impossible. So Paul is saying it goes both ways. And what he'll argue for is that Jesus is the beginning of what will find its final fruit someday that we don't know. So you might call this section the already, not yet. Already Christ is risen, not yet are we. We're awaiting that moment. And then in 29 through 34, he does this ethical interlude where he goes like this. If Christ is not risen, our preaching is in vain. And look, you might as well eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Now, some people find that very offensive, but we'll talk about that more in a moment. But Paul's basically saying in his mind, if there is no resurrection of the body, all bets are off, ethically. Then in 35 through 49, he tries to answer this question. Well, Paul, if it's true that people are bodily raised from the dead, then what kind of body is this? And he uses an analogy that some of you who have studied horticulture might not be completely comfortable with. And his analogy goes like this. When you plant a seed in the ground, it, quote, dies, and then it's raised to new life and you have a plant. Well, those of you who studied horticulture know it's not exactly dying, it's germinating, right? And so it crops up. So don't accuse Paul of being a horticulturist, okay? It's just the analogy of something in the ground that then springs to life, right? That's his analogy. And then he will say it's transformed. It's transformed from being a seed to something different. Now, the analogy that you should bear in mind in 1 Corinthians at all times is the nature of Jesus' body, which we talked about last week. A body that can both eat and relate to people, and a body that can disappear and go through walls. Okay, so what is Paul's analogy or statement? He calls it, are you ready for this? A spiritual body. A spiritual body. Now, I don't know exactly what a spiritual body is. Is it something that can eat, or is it something that can disappear? Paul doesn't try to explain that, but he basically rests his case on saying whatever we will be someday is something like what Jesus was. Spiritual body. Now, remember why you have body in here. The idea is body means personality. It means you don't drop like a drop of water into the ocean and dissolve into allness. You are still you. And that means what? You can relate to other people. So body means you as a person transformed, and you able to relate to others, to join in that heavenly choir that sings praises to God, world without end, right? Okay. So at the very end of this long chapter, he says, what's the upshot of this? Well, I've already given you hints of it, which is it means you can be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. So the chapter begins with Paul's energetic transformation of his life to the middle warning that if it's not true, we'll eat, drink, and be merry, to the very end. So therefore, get to work. You are my witnesses in the world. That's a little bit of the complexity of 1 Corinthians 15. There's tons more, but let me stop and see if you have some comments or questions about it.